Thank you for staying with News Central. As I mentioned earlier, 9 out of 10 most neglected displacement crises in the world are in Africa. This is not just me saying, it is in a report by the Norwegian Refugee Council highlighting the 10 most neglected displacement crises in the world in 2023. The only non-African country on the list is Honduras in Central America. The Council defines neglect as characterized by lack of media coverage, inadequate humanitarian funding, and insufficient international political attention. The report covers those forced to flee their homes. The submission is that an unsettling trend is emerging as the world's attention ebbs and flows around new crises and conflicts. Neglect of protracted displacement crises featured in this report is becoming, according to them, a new normal. Displacement numbers are rising and needs are spiraling out of control. Yet, funding, media attention, and political engagement remain inadequate. To discuss the implications therein of this neglect and actions that are needed, I'm joined by the Regional Coordinator, Central Africa at Institute for Security Studies, Oluwole Ojewale. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let's just get your general impression of the report and if you agree with the assessment.
Yes, one doesn't even need to read any report following the news like the one you are reporting from the media directly on TV and radio. We know that most of the neglected crises in the world now and in Africa, particularly the case of Sudan, followed by what is happening in Democratic Republic of Congo, and what we have also seen in Ethiopia as a result of the civil war that has ensued in our country. All over the places in Africa, countries are littered with internally displaced people. And even right there in Nigeria, a lot is unreported in terms of what people are going through in the the northwestern part of Nigeria. So I think it has become the new normal as a result of the negligence on the part of state authorities and the international communities who should demonstrate the duty of care. So Africa is the epicenter of displacement now.
Do you think perhaps the international community's focus on the Ukraine war and now that we have the case in Gaza has affected the response to displacement crisis in Africa, or was this already on before these crises?
Well, we've had protracted conflict in Africa before the advent or commencement of Russia invasion of Ukraine and then Israel war with Hamas in Gaza. And I think even though, Africa on most affairs is considered as the backwater, we've had some form of skeletal interest on the part of the community. But when we look at the sheer resources that is committed to combating displacement now, I think what comes to Africa is infinitesimally small compared to what goes to tiny Middle East, where there's crises in Palestine, and then what is also going on in Ukraine. But when you look at what comes to Sudan, what goes into Ethiopia, what goes into Democratic Republic of Congo, or even in Nigeria or Niger, where terrorist groups, bandits are wreaking havoc in local communities on a regular basis, or in Mali or in Burkina Faso, where about 100 soldiers were killed in the past, I think, 48 hours. Generally, the world, because of the global politics that is intertwined with what is happening in Ukraine and Gaza, I think Africa is completely neglected. And not only in terms of humanitarian support, even in terms of the scale and spread, the share of global conversation in international media is also very narrow compared to the daily experience that we have in terms of what is happening in Russia and Ukraine. And we are not saying this to diminish humanity in any way, but essentially to say that the worth of a life in North Kivu is not less significant compared to the life of any person in Kyiv in Ukraine as well. So what is good for the goose is also good for the ganders. If we discuss our common humanity, I don't think Africa should be neglected to the back burner. But we can outsource the responsibility to international communities by also absorbing ourselves of our own responsibility here in terms of what the state authorities are doing, what the multilateral agencies like the African Union and ECOWAS are also doing. I think it's just a drop in the ocean. We are not doing enough from our own domestic front here.
Okay, let me flip and see if we could ask, instead of the challenges that African countries face in responding to internal displacement crisis, are there or is there any African country, to your knowledge, that's doing fairly well with responding to internal displacement and maybe provide a model that can be copied by others? And then I'm going to come back and ask you about the challenges generally.
Well, I think there's no model that we can praise because in the first place, it's a disaster that ought to have been prevented rather than happening. Internal displacements are it's unhand in itself, but it goes through a means to arrive there. Talking about crises, conflict that ought to have been prevented in the first place, we snowball into conflict, and then on the final analysis lead to violence in which people are being displaced. So I will give you an example of what is happening in Sudan. Nobody's really showing any form of serious commitment on the part of the African continent, because we cannot talk in terms of displacement without talking about what brought us to displacement in the first place. So, for instance, Sudan is a very big country, and you see, in terms of the peace negotiation, you see middle power countries like Qatar midwifing the peace building process. One example is what is the role of the AU in all this. You see Cyril Ramaphosa, who was displaying some form of global leadership from the BRIC Convention and then taking Israel to International Criminal Court, flying over DRC, flying over Sudan, and going to Middle East to go and midwife a peace building process or a peace process. It shows that our own house is leaking here and nobody is showing leadership. So if people cannot prevent conflicts from happening in the first place, how are we sure that they are going to supply grains to people when they're internally displaced? So I think it's about a forgotten crisis on the domestic front, which the international communities are also looking at how countries in Africa are actually responding. And if you don't take ourselves serious, I think it's a fallout of that we're experiencing in terms of how the international communities have been taking us. So I don't see any model. In fact, look at what happened in Ethiopia, a civil war among the same set of people who inhabit a space called a country. Look at how they were cut off from banking, from internet, from telecommunication, food not allowed to get into to Amara region. So these are some of the complications that I think they are internally orchestrated and that makes us to be bereft of any model of response to humanitarian concern.
I completely agree with you. A question of leadership, flying over, going to sort out someone else's problem when your house is burning. But it's a fair question to ask about regional organizations like AU and ECOWAS. How can they better? They have a role to play, quite right. But is there a role they can play to get African leaders to focus more on addressing crises that lead to this displacement in the first place? I mean, take it one at a time, or do something with one to show that there is a will to address our problems ourselves.
Yes, there is AU, there is ECOWAS, and they have those instruments of diplomacy, instrument of peace negotiation, finding solutions to political crises. Those things are there. But the challenge is that the AU or the ECOWAS most of the times exist like a group of trade unionists. And I'm talking about the head of state who meet, but who cannot really speak truth to themselves. So I give you an instance in Togo in the past few days or the past few weeks or months, the incumbents unilaterally stripped the office of the president of all the power, created a new office that is going to occupy that makes him like a lifetime leader of that country. So if that kind of thing snowball into crisis, what has been the role of the of ECOWAS in that of AU? So, and this also affects their commitment to such multilateral system or agencies in terms of what they are contributing to those systems. You find out that most of the times those agencies are also funded by international donors from Europe, from the Western world, from Europe, from China. So if you don't put your money where your mouth is, it becomes difficult to be able to course correct or intervene in any of these crises because you are also waiting for external agency to come and help you to exercise control over things that should normally be within your remit. So I think these are part of the crisis. The major challenge on the part of our multilateral agencies is that they are not living up to their role as far as prevention is concerned. You need to really rise up to prevent this crisis from becoming a humanitarian challenge. And to the extent to which everybody is operating in silo, so it appears like the problem of Togo is the problem of Togo. ECOWAS can just pay lip service to it, but they are not really going to intervene because they say it's a sovereign country. But you expect that there will be, it's a form of regional hegemony that can...
So where does that leave us then? Because, I mean, before we ask for international communities' help and, you know, their role, for them to play their role, there must be actionable moves that can be taken by our leaders here to show seriousness, because what you're saying just implies we're dead even before we leave.
Yes, because I think everybody is to himself or herself in the sense that a lot of people can do many things that they get away with in the first place. It cannot be a group of equals. It cannot be a completely democratic setting in which somebody's not setting the rules, somebody's not enforcing the rules. Until countries like Nigeria, countries like Ethiopia, countries like South Africa, like Egypt, can really rise up in terms of the economic, military strength and what have you, that can make at least a regional hegemon, that will be able to speak and, I mean, sneeze and other will catch cough, that will be able to whip others into correct action, correct posturing. I think it's going to be a difficult task to be able to have such regional agencies that are going to really demonstrate leadership. But any country that is also going to rise to that occasion must put his house in order. So if Ethiopians are fighting each other, so what moral authority does Ethiopia has to exercise that leadership in East Africa? If Nigeria is wallowing in economic crisis, as people are talking about it here and there, where's the resources to really invest in regional leadership, development or posturing, let me put it that way. And I think the only country that seems to have gotten its heart right is South Africa. But, you know, it's the fellow is also much more interested in showing to the European, to the Western establishment that is the powerhouse of Africa, rather than demonstrating leadership on Africa. He led a team to Ukraine to go. He led Cyril Ramaphosa led a team of about 8 presidents to Ukraine for peace move. He has not led such move to any African country. He has not led such move to maybe West Africa or Central Africa or East Africa. So it is hypocrisy on the part of the regional community or agencies that we have. And it appears to me that countries, everyone is just to himself, to your tent, to ye history. That is what we are doing here. But when the crisis hits, it has a multiplier effect. That is the reason why you have this cross-border dimension of the displacement that is going on.
It is quite disheartening, you know, listening to you speak and, you know, trying to wrap my head around the reality of the negligence being, that's what I will call it, on the part of African leaders to the growing crisis across the continent. But then again, I don't want to lose hope. There is always hope somehow. And that the role of the media, really, the coverage. There is no day you don't see stories on maybe the Ukraine war, the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. But some of these crises in Africa, it seems we don't get that kind of, continuous bombardment of information that will awaken that sense of responsibility. So is the media in Africa, in your view, playing its role in shaping international response to the displacement in the continent?
Well, I think to a large extent, the media on the continent, I would say they are doing their bit, just like the one you are doing now. But the challenge is also that the people that we expect to help us have also created a platform through which they are selling the narrative. And the poverty has cut away most Africans away from getting access to such information, such breaking news, such analyses. And then if, for instance, the major media houses in the world decide to spend 3-4 hours of their 24 hours talking about Ukraine or talking about maybe war in Gaza, we do not have that latitude of influence to tell them the narrative that they want to sell to the world. Because as far as they are concerned, that is what matters to them within that given period. So I think to a large extent, the voices of Africa is shut out as far as these international platforms are concerned. And we have to rely on what we have in our own local context, which most of the time it is African talking to African in the real sense of it, particularly when you have this magnitude of crisis in which you are expecting international intervention. So it's something that goes beyond media. I think it's all across the board, in which those who have the power, those who have wherewithal, have created platforms that only serve their interests. And that is the reason why we are advocating that African leaders should get their house in order. I don't want to mention names of media here, but look at what the tiny country of Qatar is doing and the kind of information that is dishing to the whole world. A country of about 4 million people has created a platform. The United States has created a platform. France has created a platform. The UK has created a platform. These are platforms that have lasted many years and with which they sell the narrative that they want to sell to the public. And the people that we expect to come and intervene in, as far as these crises are concerned, that is the news platform that they are consuming. So I think a lot is just skew against Africa. And we need to really rise up in all ramifications to also create our own platform and sell the news to the world. But we must be seen to be serious, we must be seen to be credible, and we must be seen to be people that are not begging for aid here and there, as our leaders have been doing, going to all Japan African summits, Korea African summit, France African summit, Russia African summit, and all these things that are treating African as a country, whereas it's a continent of diversity of different nations and different people.
It's curious that you mentioned that, because that was our conversation last week, looking at, going to other parts of the world by African leaders. They're summoned, so to speak, and the submission was quite intriguing. We're winding down now, so I would like to ask, how can African countries balance the need for national security with the need to protect and assist internally displaced persons?
The first thing is, I think we need to prioritize that now. Nations, government need to rise up to the occasion. And it has to be platforms and agencies that are really scrutinized transparently. You saw what happened in Nigeria recently, and that what that cesspool has shown to us is that that humanitarian agency has actually become a conduit pipe for corruption over the years that we don't know, in which the same agency claimed that they are feeding children at home even during COVID-19 and all those things. So the leadership must demonstrate sincerity and then ensure that the poor and the vulnerable are actually attended to. I think we have some form of resources that we can commit to that if the leadership is truly sincere. For people that are displaced, at least within our country, if Ghana will handle internal displacement within its territory, Ivory Coast will do that, Nigeria will do that, I think there will be less of interest in calling for international intervention in terms of providing humanitarian support to some of these internally displaced people. What we have is that there's no sincerity on the part of the leadership, in most of these countries that are affected by internally displaced persons. And there's also a posture or a disposition on the part of our leaders to consider some of these things as a responsibility of the international communities. No, I don't think so. We have to first demonstrate commitment to our people. If we have sworn to the Constitution to defend to defend the people, and we subscribe to the notion that the whole purpose of government is for security of life and the welfare of the people. When people are internally displaced, the state, the subnational government, the national central government must demonstrate that humanity, that empathy, so to speak, to attend to the need of the people. I'm a researcher. I've done a lot of studies on this particular matter, and I can tell you, and I know that the media houses are also doing investigative report. The condition in which most of the internally displaced persons are living is deplorable. Some dogs or goats or sheep cannot even live where they are living. So it's very important to also see this as a local crisis to start with. So local government, state government, or whatever it is called in any of this country must see that as their primary responsibility. But where I think we need to concentrate effort is the preventive aspect, whether it is in climate displacement, displacement that is induced as a result of violence, the indices, the factors that actually precipitate displacement in the first place, whether it is natural or human, can be prevented or minimized.
I mean, I could let you go on and on. I'm actually very invested in listening to your submissions, but we're time constrained, so I will have to say thank you very much for your submissions.
Thank you so much for having me.